Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Charleston. And welcome to this eagerly awaited event in the Charleston Festival, which we've entitled Call of the Wild. We've described it as an event that deals with humans pitted against forces of nature, so an experience very similar to coming to the Charleston Festival, but without the tea tent, the bar and the bookstore. As you can see from the lush vegetation on stage, the suitcases, we've tried to create an ambience in which even the most intrepid explorers would feel comfortable. And I couldn't be more delighted to welcome our speakers, Christopher Ondaatje on my left, Tim Jeal in the middle, and chairing the event, Sigrid Rausing. Sigrid is going to say a little bit more about Christopher and Tim, so I'm going to say something about her. Sigrid is a publisher and philanthropist. She studied for her PhD in social anthropology at University College London, and she spent much of 1993 and 1994 living on a collective farm in Estonia, doing fieldwork. She subsequently published her research in the book History, Memory and Identity in Post-Soviet Estonia, The End of a Collective Farm, which appeared in 2004, published by the Oxford University Press. In 2005, Sigrid co-founded the publishing house Portobello Books with her husband, film and theatre producer Eric Abraham. And the same year, she bought Granta Publications, so she's now the publisher of Granta Magazine and Granta Books. She's a passionate and generous supporter of human rights. She was in 2004 the joint winner of the International Service Human Rights Award in the Global Human Rights Defender category. In 2005, she won a Beacon Special Award for Philanthropy, and she is a member of the jury of the Per Anger Prize for Human Rights Defenders and serves on the advisory council of the board of the Coalition for International Criminal Court. She's an honorary fellow of the London School of Economics, and Charleston is extremely fortunate to have her as a trustee of the Charleston Trust. So now I'm going to hand over to Sigrid. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And welcome to Charleston. I'm here with Tim Jeal and Christopher Ondaatje to talk about their recently published books, Explorers of the Nile, The Triumph and Tragedy of a Great Victorian Adventure, and The Last Colonial, Curious Adventures and Stories from a Vanishing World. Tim Jeal has written 3 classic biographies of adventurous Victorians, Livingstone, Baden-Powell and Stanley, the last of which was named Sunday Times Biography of the Year, and in America won the National Book Critics Circle Award for Biography. His 3 biographies were all listed as notable books of the year by the literary editors of the New York Times and the Washington Post. Tim's fascination with Africa dates back to the 1960s. At present, he's working on a new edition of his Life of Livingstone for Yale University Press. First published 40 years ago, it has never been out of print. He wrote his Life of Stanley 35 years later because it took that long to be admitted to the massive Stanley archives in Brussels. He was the first biographer to gain access. Explorers of the Nile also contains much new research, notably concerning the enigmatic John Hanning Speke. Tim is also a novelist and a former winner of the John Llewellyn Prize. His memoir, Swimming with My Father, was shortlisted in 2004 for the Penn Ackley Prize for autobiography. He's here to talk about Explorers of the Nile, which was published last September to great critical acclaim. Christopher Ondaatje was born in Ceylon, the son of a tea planter from a well-known island family. He was brought up on the plantation and sent to school in England as a teenager. After independence in 1948, his family lost the plantation and Christopher emigrated to Canada in 1956 with only $13 in his pocket. He worked at several magazines and newspapers, and in 1967 founded the Pagurian Press, which eventually became the Pagurian Corporation. In 1988, he sold all his business interests and turned to the literary world and the world of exploration. He is the author of 9 books, including the best-selling Burton biography, Sind Revisited, and Journey to the Source of the Nile, and more recently, Hemingway in Africa and Wolf in Ceylon. He was a member of Canada's 1964 bobsled team and is a fellow of the Royal Geographical Society and an honorary fellow of the Royal Society of Literature. He lives in London and Devon and was knighted by the Queen in 2003. The title of his latest book is The Last Colonial, Curious Adventures and Stories from a Vanishing World. This is a series of stories from his life, from Ceylon, Canada, Africa, and England. It's beautifully illustrated by the extraordinary Brazilian artist Ana Maria Pacheco. Please join me in welcoming both of them to Charleston. I'm going to begin with Christopher Ondaatje, who is here to talk about the secret of the short story, The Last Colonial. Christopher.
Great. I think this is on, right? Sorry. I've always tried to find the secret of the short story. Frank O'Connor, the prolific Irish author, wrote a provocative study of the short story, The Lonely Voice, in 1963. He said that the short story remains by its nature remote from the community, romantic, individualistic, and intransigent. Now, this might apply to D.H. Lawrence, James Joyce, Hemingway, and Catherine Ann Porter, but surely not Hans Christian Andersen, Turgenev, Mark Twain, Tolstoy, and Kipling. The short story is a strange form. No one really dominates it. The short story has no Shakespeare, nor Dickens, or Proust, nor even a Turgenev or Chekhov. Short stories evoke in one a sense of multiplicity. Is there something anonymous about the short story as a form? Yet there are elements that bind together short stories more closely than poems, plays, and novels. Henry James and D.H. Lawrence are two of my favorite short storytellers, but they are not the same. Lawrence runs away from the submerged population where he grew up. James stays in the world of his upbringing, mixing sexuality and ghostliness into a fascinating compound. Yet, neither is a fantasist, like Hans Christian Andersen, Edgar Allan Poe, Lewis Carroll, or Kafka. Is the short story a Chekhovian art where everyone is submerged in loneliness and misunderstanding? Must a short story be about human loneliness to endure? Mark Twain, Thomas Mann, Hemingway, Faulkner, and Scott Fitzgerald all knew a great deal about loneliness, but that does not seem to be the center of any one of them as a storyteller. D.H. Lawrence tells us to trust the tale, not the artist. And let's face it, great stories rarely manifest only a single human characteristic. After studying this unique art form, I have come to realize that you cannot really study it, although you will learn a lot. I believe that short story writers are born and not made. Perhaps short stories are allied together only as miracles. It is the accident of genius that appeals to me. I have always wanted to write short stories. And God knows, after hacking myself through the literary world all these years, I don't know if I've got anywhere close to where I would like to be. In order to write, you must have something to write about. Lots of people want to write, but they don't have anything to write about. I'm lucky. I've spent a lifetime going out on a limb, doing all kinds of crazy things, just so that I would have something to write about. My brother is a fiction writer. He can make it up, but I'm not. My books are non-fiction. The Prime Minister of Canada, Man-Eater of Panani, Sin Revisited, Journey to the Source of the Nile, Hemingway in Africa, Wolf in Ceylon. They all involved an enormous amount of research and a considerable amount of risk, danger, and travel to places where you cannot even go now, all just to get something to write about. It was fantastic. I had an end purpose, and it was hard work. Hard work researching before, hard work researching during, and hard work afterwards, putting it all together in a presentable form. A book. But this is not short story writing. Most people can do what I did if they just have the talent and drive. But there is no accident of genius. That is something else. And where these great short story writers get their inspiration from, God only knows. Nevertheless, they did encourage me to put down my own experiences in my book, The Last Colonial. Here is one of them, the Cemani Key Leopard. What do? I press this, right? Which one do I press? Oh, yeah.
It's one of the arrows.
Okay, that's the map, excuse me. In November 1996, nearing the end of a 3-month journey tracing the footsteps of the Victorian explorers in East Africa, I had reached Kasese, at the foot of the Ruwenzori Mountains in Uganda. My quest was to unravel the mystery of the source of the River Nile, which was designated as being Lake Victoria by John Hanning Speke in 1858. I believe, far from being just the source, Lake Victoria is in fact one of the 2 great reservoirs of the Nile, the other being Lake Albert, that are fed by 2 mighty rivers, the Kagera, which drains the Burundi highlands, and the Semliki, which drains the Ruwenzori Mountains. I had traveled from Zanzibar to Bagamoyo on the east coast of Africa, then up to Tabora, Ujiji on Lake Tanganyika, Lake Victoria, and Ripon Falls, down the Victoria Nile to Murchison Falls and the north end of Lake Albert, and eventually along the east coast of Lake Albert to Fort Portal and Kasese, a sleepy mountain village in the Ruwenzoris. Exhausted, thirsty, and extremely hungry, we relaxed over some Nile beers before dinner. We discussed the Ruwenzori Mountains at length. Our initial plan was to spend 6 or 8 days climbing some of their eastern slopes. I had hoped to get above the cloud line, at least to see the major peaks so as to view the drainage system from that elevated position and come to whatever conclusions I could about it. But the next day, Kasese was in semi-chaos. Rebels, possibly from Zaire, had crossed the border only 10 kilometers west of the town and were moving down the Kasinga Channel, which runs between Lake George and Lake Edward. Armed men were everywhere, some in uniform, but many not. Some were refugees. Even without understanding a word of the language being spoken, we could tell that everyone in Kasese was in a high state of alarm. And so I made a decision to change course. Instead of climbing, I would round the southernmost tip of the Ruwenzori Range until I had reached the Cemani Key River on the border with Zaire. Few people ventured into this region, which is an equatorial forest, dense, muggy, luxuriant, mosquito and fly-infested swampland. We would be almost totally alone there, or so we thought. Descending into the Cemani Key Valley, I noticed the lower we went, the shorter the inhabitants seemed to be. Still further down, we started to see people carrying spears, then bows and arrows, and finally some men with long beards. At last, almost at the foot of the mountains, lay the equatorial jungle we had expected. Very humid and hot and dense, with massive trees soaring to great heights. We were right at the edge of the Cemani Key forest, a virtually untouched tropical lowland forest separated from the Ituri forest of Zaire by the Cemani Key River. We pitched camp in a small clearing about 45 meters square and completely surrounded by tall cane grass, less than 50 meters from the rugged mountain road we had driven along. Walking further south into the jungle, we found a small group. Sorry about this. How do I get this? Of Bamba and Bakonjo people. I'm not quite sure where to. Often referred to as pygmies. However, nightfall was coming, and so we headed back to camp, ate dinner, and settled in for the night. I, on my own, in a small plastic tent about 30 meters away from Thad Peterson and our 2 Tanzanian bearers in a larger tent. Under the forest canopy, the night was exceptionally dark, and I was lying on an uncomfortable ground sheet being bitten by minute insects known as bakukums. The bites left painful welts, particularly around the eyes and ears. Sleeping was difficult, but eventually I dozed off. Maybe only an hour or so later, there was the jarring sound of gunfire, yelling, and shouting on the mountain road. I lay motionless, a virtual prisoner in my tent, thinking about the mayhem I had witnessed a few hours earlier in Kasese. What I had not realized was during that day, Laurent Kabila's troops had made their first attempt to overthrow the dictatorship of President Mobutu in Zaire. It was an ordeal to listen to the sounds because I had no idea what to do. The nocturnal turmoil lasted for a good hour, then quietened down somewhat. I silently unzipped the front flap of the tent and shone my torch into the long grass on either side of the narrow path that led away from the clearing. Imagine my surprise when, instead of shadowy rebel soldiers, I caught sight of 2 bright orange eyes shining back at me from the edge of the clearing. From long experience, I knew such eyes could only belong to a large cat, perhaps a leopard. I shone my torch at the eyes and saw a motionless figure, which was still gazing at me. Then, without moving its feet, the stealthy predator turned its head and looked down the narrow path towards the sound of the crowd on the mountain road. In the torch beam, I recognized the tawny hide and rosettes of a young female leopard with a long, twitching tail, staring at something I couldn't see in the distance. I remained rooted to the spot, but I kept shining my torch on the beast. After some long moments, perhaps even a minute, the leopardess slowly, soundlessly moved away from the path into the center of the clearing towards an invisible spot behind my tent, concealed from the road. I dared not move or create a sound, but very slowly and silently crouched down again on my ground sheet and shut off the torch. The sound of fleeing rebels seemed to be finally moving away, the danger becoming more distant. In due course, I heard only the forest noises, sharpened by my now acute alertness. There was the occasional rustle of the wind in the trees, the whir of tsitsadas, the drone of a persistent mosquito. And then I became aware of another sound, right next to my tent. I strained my ears, and there could be no mistake. I could hear a low, guttural breathing, only a few feet away. Had the leopardess sought protection or cover from my tent, away from the threat of the people on the mountain road? This was hard to believe, yet there seemed to be no other reasonable explanation. I tried to shine my torch through the thin plastic of the tent wall onto the creature apparently lurking nearby, but the task was hopeless. So I simply crouched and listened. Her relaxed breathing continued. After a while, I felt that the two of us had formed some undefined, unspoken bond, as if together we were less vulnerable to any passing intruder. Suddenly, more voices were audible. some way off, but coming closer. At least 2 men were walking along the path towards the clearing. I could not see any light moving. They appeared not to have a torch. I dared not shine my torch for fear of giving away my position. On the other hand, the night was so dark it seemed likely the strangers would fail to see the tents and would trip over the guy ropes holding our fragile shelters upright. The voices grew louder still, and I knew I had to do something. I thought of running, but that seemed like a kind of suicide. What if the men were armed? And how would the beast react? Neither of us moved. Then, when the voices were almost upon us and we were nearly certain to be discovered, I heard a rasping warning from the leopardess, an unmistakable snarl. Only inches away from my left side. The talking stopped, like a switch being flicked off. And a second or so later came the sound of footsteps running back along the path. There was no further communication from the leopardess. For the rest of the night, I lay motionless on my ground sheet, listening to the unhurried breathing of my strange companion against the eerie noises of the night. In fact, I must have slept a bit, because when I awoke, there were shreds of daylight heralding dawn, straggling through the upper branches of the forest. The front flap of my tent was still open. I was still too frightened to move. But at long last, as the morning became lighter and the greeting calls of the jungle birds became bolder, I plucked up the courage to peer out of my tent towards the spot where my nighttime companion must have lain. Needless to say, she had gone. There was nothing to be seen, not even a scratch in the dust or a claw mark on the small anthill that had been her uneven resting place. The leopardess had vanished as silently as she had come. A few minutes later, a concerned Thad Peterson crawled across our clearing. "Are you all right, Chris?" "Yes," I called back. "Did you hear the commotion on the road?" "Of course," he replied, "but they seem to have gone now." Indeed, there was no one else around. I suppose the rebel exodus across the border took place at night to escape detection. "I think it's fairly safe now," he added. I went over to his tent. "Did you see the leopard?" I asked. "What leopard?" Thad inquired. "Oh, I thought I saw one last night sometime before midnight after the commotion started. But I may have been mistaken. My intimate feline encounter would have been too difficult to explain, and perhaps even more difficult to believe. So I never mentioned it to Thad or to anyone else." Thank you.
Gosh. What can I say? Except I think I'm not as brave as Christopher. I think I should have had a heart attack on the spot. I think I would remember that when David Livingstone was caught by a lion, it shook him, he said, as a terrier does a rat. And he could hear his bone crunching in the creature's mouth. The only other one that would have also been in my mind if I'd been next to something as awesome as this was there was a young man in East Africa. There's a railway line called the Misery Line, the Lunatic Line. I live in Hampstead, and the Misery Line is, of course, the Northern Line. And so deeply imprinted into my consciousness is it that I have to usurp the other one. Anyway, the young man who was the engineer on the other one was driving this thing towards Uganda through Kenya when 100 of his Indian workers were eaten by 2 man-eating lions. And obviously they downed tools. They simply wouldn't do it anymore. This young man was literally in his 20s, mid-20s, about 25, and on him was the responsibility of killing this animal. He used to lie out at night, hoping to get a shot at it, because it only hunted at night. and it'd steal into these people's camp and grab one. And he would lie, but he could never get a shot. It was about 3 weeks that this went on. And the thing that he remembered most, which is in his diary, the thing that really shocked him, was he could hear the great cats purring as, wait for it, they licked the flesh off their victims so that they would have their fresh blood. Anyway, look, enough of this. But as you, I just don't know how he's alive and here today, but there we are. What made the great Victorian explorers of Africa so different from the general run of humanity? I suppose for a start, it's the likelihood that they would die in the obsessive pursuit of their never-to-be-made discoveries, never-to-be-made-again discoveries. On Mungo Park's final expedition, 90% of the 44 Europeans with him perished, and Park himself was driven at spear point from his boat and drowned. David Livingstone suffered 26 attacks of malaria on his great Trans-Africa journey, and all 5 of Stanley's white companions died on his first 2 journeys. The Arab slave trade had made Africans hostile to strangers for fairly obvious reasons, so explorers faced real danger. In East Africa, in fact, very shortly after he'd arrived, Burton had been told the story of how a young French lieutenant, a man called Maison, had recently been disemboweled and had had his genitals sliced off while he was still alive. But enough. One can see that these people were unusual. My fascination, as distinct from theirs, with Africa, began in 1963, when, aged 18, I travelled alone from Egypt to South Africa at a time when the British Empire still made Africa quite safe to cross. I travelled at first by Nile steamer and then by bus and then mostly hitchhiking in lorries, trucks and cars. As whatever sturdy vehicle I happened to be in sped along, juddering in and out of potholes, it did occur to me what a very different affair African travel had been before the lorry, the Land Rover, and the great safari companies. There'd been no roads, of course, no maps, no mobile phones, no sat-nav, and because the tsetse fly killed oxen and horses, they had no choice but to walk literally thousands of miles across Africa. They might be away, too, for 3 or 4 or even 5 years. In Livingstone's case, even longer. Without beasts of burden, they required scores of porters to carry the brass wire and cloth needed to buy food and pay to pass through chiefs' territories. And if deserted by these carriers, a traveller could literally starve to death like a shipwrecked mariner. By the way, the picture, which should be behind me, yes, thank God it is, shows the problems of travel in the rainy season. Stanley used this particular one as illustration on his lectures. So why did Burton, Speke, and all the rest find Africa irresistible? Diamonds and gold hadn't yet been found in South Africa, so it wasn't wealth. Fame was important, but a longing for adventure mattered more. Through Africa, men hoped to reinvent themselves. Rich Samuel Baker had worked briefly in the city, where he'd hated the anonymity of office life and had longed to leap into the unknown as an explorer. Stanley, the workhouse boy, yearned to obliterate his unendurable past and escape the daily self he despised. Livingstone dreamed of transforming a whole continent by opening it to trade and Christianity. Discovery is mostly my mania, declared self-dramatizing Richard Burton. I ask myself why, and the only echo is, damned fool, the devil drives. And indeed, daredevilry and addiction to danger were certainly key ingredients. Explorers arriving at Zanzibar often felt sort of depressed for days as their adrenaline sank down. And because explorers suffered horribly, they were desperate to be first. There was blank space at the centre of all maps of Africa. None of the great lakes were depicted, and all the largest rivers trickled away in mysterious lines of dots. Ever since the pharaohs, people had longed to find the Nile source and learn how the river could pass through the hottest, largest desert in the world for 1,200 miles without being refreshed by a single tributary. By the middle of the 19th century, no one had come close to solving the mystery. Many had died in doing the obvious thing, which was, of course, pushing on upstream until cataracts, hostile Africans, or disease stopped them. In 1853, a young Indian Army officer, gosh, I'm getting worried about this thing, Richard Burton, a linguist, self-declared sexologist and author, had just completed the pilgrimage to Mecca, disguised as a Muslim peddler. And I really can't believe he looked like that, but there we are. Though his father was a retired colonel and he'd been born in respectable Torquay, Burton reinvented himself as Ruffian Dick, a perpetual maverick. Oh, God. I'm doing a Christopher. In Cairo, at exclusive Shepherd's Hotel, he wore his Muslim disguise and scandalized European guests by immodestly telling them he'd been on a debauch that had beaten anything in the Arabian Nights. In Egypt, a German missionary was saying he'd seen snow peaks in East Africa and had heard from Arab slavers that there were lakes near these mountains. Burton rapidly forgot about Arabia. These lakes must surely feed the Nile and be the ones mentioned by the great Ptolemy. Yep, there we are. Here's a medieval map later showing, oh gosh, I'm going to try the laser. Oh, yes? No, it's hitting the, no, I can't do it. Anyway, here are these things here are meant for the mountains of the moon, and these two little things, the two lakes which are the possible source of the Nile. So when anybody heard about lakes, they immediately thought about this sort of map. Yep. In April 1855, 4 Britons, including Burton and John Speke, oh no, there we are, and John Speke, another adventure-mad officer, were encamped by the sea in Somalia, intending to head for the lakes directly overland from the East African coast, and this was a rather novel idea. At 2 a.m., however, their camp was invaded by 200 Somalis, and 1 Brit was instantly killed. Burton's sabre was useless against javelins, so Speke had to defend the tent with his revolver. As he ducked down to get a clearer view, Burton roared, "Don't step back or they'll think we're running." Sure he'd been called a coward, Speke leapt forward and thrust his gun against the breast of a huge man and pulled the trigger. But the cylinder would not rotate. A dozen Somalis fell on him. Meanwhile, a javelin ripped through Burton's cheek, splitting his palate and smashing out 2 molars. Just then, Speke felt fingers clawing near his genitals. My hair stood on end, he remembered, and I feared unmanly mutilations. Luckily for him, they were only checking whether a dagger was hidden in his trousers. When another man plunged his spear into Speke's thigh, he reckoned his time was up and ran towards the sea. Now, can I do better this time? Oh, yes. And ran towards the sea, in his own words, like wildfire, almost naked and quite bare upon the feet. Somehow he reached the shore. Astonishingly, 3 years on, Speke and Burton chose to return to Africa, and in 1858 became the first Europeans to reach Lake Tanganyika, 750 miles from the East African coast. Briefly blinded by ophthalmia, Speke could not actually see the water, and Burton was travelling in a litter, having lost all sensation in his legs. While at the lake, an insect burrowed deep into Speke's right ear, gnawing maddeningly at his tympanum. He poured in melted butter and even thrust in a penknife, which killed it, but left him deaf on that side of his head. The duo needed to reach the north end of the lake to see if a river flowed out towards the Nile. Burton wrote, "Wealth, health, even life was to be risked for this prize." But only hours from their objective, the African owner of their vessel ordered his paddlers to turn back to avoid a fight with local Warundi. Burton was too ill to object. In fact, he'd had enough of canoe travelling, in his own words, so they would have to return another year, he told Speke, who was absolutely mortified. So he volunteered to find a lake 200 miles to the northeast, said by local Arabs who'd not actually seen it, the ones he talked to anyway, to be bigger than Lake Tanganyika. With Burton still sick, Speke went on alone, becoming the first white man to reach Africa's largest lake, which he called Victoria. Being due south of the known Nile and almost 4,000 feet above sea level, a Nile link seemed pretty likely. But when told this, a jealous Burton roared that Speke had not proved that his lake had a north-flowing outlet or was even a single sheet of water, and Burton was right. But secretly, and this is the thing, Burton admitted in a letter to the Secretary of the Royal Geographical Society there are grave reasons for believing it, Speke's Lake, to be the source of the principal feeder of the White Nile. Yet in public he ridiculed Speke's claim. On returning home, Burton submitted a plan for reaching the source via Somalia. But because he was so weak and his proposed route was unrealistic, the RGS decided to send Speke to Africa with a new companion. No? Yeah, okay, very good. Another soldier, James Grant, to explore the large lake and find its outlet. Burton never forgave what he unjustly called Speke's betrayal in not returning with him. And though Speke had made all the scientific observations for longitude and latitude, Burton would write, "I opened the way and did the whole work of opening the continent," which I think really, in the circumstances, was quite a claim for a man who'd been carried for 1,000 miles. In 1862, Speke reached Uganda as its first white visitor. And there he is, being received by Mutesa. Actually, it's slightly ahead in time, because he's with his companion, who actually didn't arrive straight away. And in fact, Speke went to the main outfall of Lake Victoria without Grant, who was extremely ill at the time. He had an ulcerated leg, in fact, which detained him en route for months. And Speke had the kind of cough that keeps you up all night, and his liver hurt like hell. But anyway, he found this unspectacular waterfall on the northern bank of Lake Victoria. And he was absolutely certain that this was the source of the Nile. But he hadn't actually proved that he was looking at the same water he'd seen several years earlier when he'd been at the southern side of it. And until someone sailed round it, the truth was going to remain unknown. Speke was a prudish bore, say most of Burton's biographers. I found evidence to the contrary. When the king confided that his penis might be too small for him to father many children, a reassuring Speke said, "Size doesn't matter." But Mutesa insisted a short stick could not be so good as a long stick, because the long one could reach so much further, while the short one would only knock about the doorway. Anyway, here he is, posing naked to Speke for his portrait. And I'm afraid he can't have enjoyed the fact that Speke had drawn his genitals remarkably small. The supposedly sexless Speke fell in love with Mary, who he described as his beautiful Venus, a former wife of the late ruler. She was a present from the king's mother, and is sadly not in this group. I do apologise. Must have been away that day. At first, Mary was loving, but then became infatuated with her Nganja, or witch doctor, whom she urged Speke to employ. "Oh, God, was I then a hen-pecked husband," he cried. Since she called herself his wife, it seemed that she and Speke really were proper lovers. On learning Mary had invited the Nganja into their hut in his absence, Speke threatened to beat him. But then Mary begged to be beaten instead. "This touching appeal," wrote Speke, "nearly drove my judgment from me. I dismissed her and rushed out of the house with an overflowing heart and walked about till after dark, when returning to my desolate abode, I turned supperless into bed and slept not one wink." Speke gave Mary a parting gift, in token I ever loved her, and could do so now, a black blanket as a sign of mourning. She had almost broken my heart. In England, Speke and Grant were welcomed home as heroes. But when Burton again rubbished his claim to have found the Nile's source, and Livingstone joined in this time, his reputation collapsed. Just before he was due to debate in public with Burton in Bath, he went out shooting birds with a cousin who lived nearby. Climbing over a low wall with his gun at half-cock, he accidentally shot himself under the arm, severing his coronary arteries. Although the angle of the wound made suicide impossible, Burton said Speke had killed himself because scared he would lose the Nile debate. And I honestly have to ask you that if you wish to kill yourself by shooting, you would not try to do so under the armpit while walking over a low wall. In 1863, while coming down the Nile towards Egypt, Speke had met near Juba a rich acquaintance, Samuel Baker. Hopefully, no, that's Mrs. Baker, well, Mrs. Baker to be, who, despite being a widower, with 4 motherless daughters at home, had dreamed for years, rather inappropriately, of becoming an African explorer. Baker had hoped, if Speke had died, to go on south and find the source himself. Though vexingly alive, Speke generously told him about an important undiscovered lake northeast of Victoria, only 250 miles away. Accompanied by his teenage mistress? No? Oh, God. Oh, God. That's David Livingstone. Ah. I know, I'm as bad as Christopher. I'm worse. Ah. It's like magic, isn't it, when it comes right? Accompanied by his teenage mistress, Florence von Sass, whom he had bought or abducted from a Bulgarian slave market, Baker was crossing a swamp, bridged by a trembling web of aquatic plants, when he turned and saw Florence sinking gradually through the weeds while her face was distorted and purple. For 4 days she lay unconscious. Baker dug her grave. Amazingly, on the 5th day she opened her eyes and began to recover. In March 1864 they reached the lake, and Baker claimed that his Lake Albert, as he called it, was larger and more important than Speke's Victoria. In fact, it was neither. By the time Baker came home, David Livingstone, you've seen him before, the first European to have crossed the continent from coast to coast, had been sent to Africa by the Royal Geographical Society to determine whether Speke or Burton was right and where Baker's Lake fitted in. Though a former missionary, Livingstone was absolutely no saint. He prided himself on travelling beyond other men's line of things. He believed the source lay far to the south, and in March 1870, after suffering from flesh-eating ulcers and mass desertions, he stood on the banks of a mighty river 250 miles west of Lake Tanganyika and 1,000 miles from any coast. But before he could buy canoes from local Arab slave traders to see if this river became the Nile, he witnessed a massacre of 400 women and children. Oh, God, I am sorry. I'm pointing it at you. Oh. Ah. God, it's absolutely inconceivable. Because his remaining porters now refused to travel any further, and because he could no longer endure travelling with Arabs, as he had been doing earlier, he was compelled to return to Ujiji on Lake Tanganyika. And at journey's end, after several narrow escapes, oh, yes, well, you had a fleeting glimpse of Stanley, yes? I think I'm going to leave him up, because subliminally you saw that he was threatened with spears, David Livingstone, which is much more effective than a more straightforward thing. But on a hill nearby, he gets back home, he's desperately ill, and all his stores have been stolen. So he thinks that it's the end of his whole enterprise, poor Livingstone, and he's been at it for 7 years, so you can imagine how he feels. Yes. Is that better? Yes. Right. But on a hill nearby, an illegitimate 30-year-old journalist and former workhouse boy was encamped. Born John Rowlands in North Wales, but now pretending to be Henry Stanley from Missouri, where he'd recently lived, Stanley probably never asked the famous question, Dr. Livingstone, I presume. Well, I'm going to leave it at that. You've just seen the meeting, again, rather briefly. The page where it should have been written had been torn from his diary, and it was not mentioned in Livingstone's diary either. Stanley himself had had the brilliant idea of interviewing for the New York Herald this world-famous man who had vanished into the interior 5 years earlier. These two prickly individuals gelled and travelled with surprising ease to the tip of Lake Tanganyika, where they found the river flowed in. So the Nile source therefore had to be Speke's Victoria and its feeders, or Livingstone's Lualaba. The fatherless Stanley quickly grew close to the older Livingstone. Despite intolerance and vanity, Livingstone was a man of deep convictions and a sense of humour. His smile, he said, was like that of an old tippo due to his lost teeth, and overall he was, he insisted, a dreadful old fogey. When Stanley very reluctantly left his honorary father to break his amazing story, Livingstone headed south to follow the Lualaba. He would die in 1873 in the swampy headwaters of that river, of blood loss, malaria, and an obstructed colon. He travelled on till almost his last day and was in such pain that his men couldn't lift him from his litter, so the wall of his hut had to be breached so he could be taken out without being lifted from his bed. It is not all pleasure, this exploration, he recorded sublimely at this time. After his death, the source became a huge story again, and Stanley persuaded James Gordon Bennett, the owner of the New York Herald, to send him back to Africa to see whether Livingstone or Speke had found the source. To do so, Stanley had to attempt a 7,000-mile journey dwarfing all earlier expeditions. And there it is, you get an idea from one side of Africa to the other, round Lake Victoria, round Lake Tanganyika, if possible up to Albert, and then all the way down the Congo. An amazing journey. He left with 228 followers, about 20 wives and children as well. And before reaching Lake Victoria, 62 had already died of disease or had been diverted or killed by Africans. And 2 of his 3 English companions had succumbed to disease. One of them would drown later. Slave dives were already on the lake, and local tribes hated strangers. But Stanley dared sail around Victoria in a small boat crewed by 11 men, risking being surrounded by hostile canoes and killed. He travelled 1,000 miles in all in this boat, and he found this one outflow, Speke's outflow. By mid-October 1876, Stanley was 450 miles to the southwest on the banks of the Lualaba, Livingstone's river. No white man or Arab had ever travelled beyond this point, and Stanley wrote, "I can die, but I will not go back. I wish I could do an American southern accent with Welsh undertones, I really do. In 2 or 3 days, we shall begin the great struggle with this mystery. I cannot tell whether I shall reveal it in person or whether it will be left to my dark followers." A chain of 7 cataracts obliged him and his men to drag their boats overland, increasing their vulnerability to attack. I pen these lines, he wrote at this time, with half a feeling that they will never be read by another white person. Day and night we are pained with the awful drumming which announces our arrival. On 7 February, the river turned west, away from the north, and Stanley for the first time heard it referred to as Ikuta ya Congo. This was conclusive. The Lualaba was the Congo and not the Nile. Speke's case was proved, and Burton's and Livingstone's was destroyed. Stanley was glad for Speke's memory, but sad for Livingstone's. Lake Victoria, the Nile's principal reservoir, the other being Albert, is fed principally by the Kagera River, which rises in Burundi, and can therefore be seen as the Nile's ultimate source. I expect you've seen Miss Lumley up there with a nice young man. It's currently disputed which of the Kagera's 2 branches is the main one. And this is, in truth, a real problem, because it's not just southerliness that's important in these matters, it's also volume of water and length. And unfortunately, with each expedition that goes down one branch or the other, one being called the Rukara, the other the Rufubu, you get different measurements, and this is a real difficulty for it. Also, there is another problem with suggesting that the Kagera is the principal source of the Nile, because there is an intervening 150 miles of Lake Victoria between where the Kagera flows in and where Speke's outlet flows out. So can you have a river which is not continuous? Only from Speke's Ripon Falls outflow does the Nile receive its name and assume a defined and continuous course. And I would also have problems in awarding this prize to people other than those who in the 25 years worked out the entire African watershed, where all the lakes were, where the rivers went, which directions they flowed into them and out of them, and a vast amount of tramping and all the rest of it. A couple of Germans called Baumann and Kant did the work on the Kagera and found the sources of each, but of course people have found new sources since then. And I really don't think their achievement is comparable to Speke's and Burton's and Livingstone's and Stanley's. I mean, just look at that journey. When Stanley reached the coast, only 112 of the 228 men were left. He'd lost 1/3 of his body weight, and he'd also lost his fiancée, although he didn't know that yet. She hadn't waited for him, but had gone off with a rolling stock millionaire. When Stanley reached the coast, only 112 of the 228 men were left, and that is a shocking statistic. In unveiling the Nile's secrets, he had shown that the laurels belonged to Speke, but the damage done by Burton's 12-year belittlement would never be put right. Having denigrated Speke in 3 high-profile books, Burton waited 4 years to bury his climb down in an obscure publication. And because Burton is such a wonderful, wicked, sexy person who shocks the respectable, and he hinted at homosexual encounters as well as homosexual ones, heterosexual and blah-de-blah, and because he wrote savagely amusing letters and made unexpurgated translations of the Kama Sutra, he remains a figure of immense fascination today, ideal for naughty TV docs like Rupert Everett's. Speke was no self-publicist, poor chap, and unlike Burton, enjoyed the company of Africans much as Livingstone had done. Burton disliked Africans very much. Speke also relished the immense privilege of entering the Kingdom of Buganda as the first European ever to have done so. Believe me, I'd raise a glass to him and all the others, including Burton, if I only had one in my hand. Well, it's not that good.
Thank you very much for those interesting readings.
And I apologise to the people at the back.
I want to go back, first of all, Christopher, to your story, the Cemani Key Leopard. When you read the story, one gets the sense that, one almost wants to have a capitalized leopard. One gets the sense that she is in some way protecting you in this situation, in this highly dangerous situation. But you leave the reader a little uncertain about which way you're going with this. One senses your own agnosticism in it, and that agnosticism, I think, really runs like a thread through all the stories. Was that a deliberate choice on your part?
No, not at all, not at all. Believe me, I wasn't ever frightened of the leopard. You were much more frightened of the rebels because, they were just fleeing Zaire away from Mobutu. Although I didn't know this at the time. We had 2 jeeps. We had guns illegally strapped to the bottom of them, which we were not allowed to have in Uganda. And, they would have killed us for the shirts on our back, or the jeeps, or anything, really. They literally had absolutely nothing. The leopard was just something that happened in this terrible fear that I had. No, it wasn't at all agnostic. In fact, when you're doing that and you think the end has come, what do? And I remember the situation very well. Basically, I prayed. And my part of the deal, if you like, was if I ever got out of this situation alive, I would try and change myself and try and do some good in the world. Seriously, all this philanthropy, which we're not going to talk about, is really as a result of that. I didn't think I was going to survive, and the leopard was just something that happened. I know I've chased leopards all over the world and written about them, but really this was just an extraordinary occurrence that just came and went, and it's a true story. And it wasn't dangerous. Just being close to this feline creature may appear to be dangerous, but I was much more scared of the people fleeing Zaire.
Yeah. One senses, in fact, through all the stories, there is a mysteriousness, there is a slight mystique, and I think one of the strengths of the book is that mystique is equally present in England, in Canada, as it is in Ceylon or in Africa. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, remember that sort of short introduction that I gave on short stories. You've got to have something to write about. It's in my mind, it's very much harder to do a short story, and certainly I don't want to do an autobiography or let anybody else do a biography, because then they'll do the good and the bad. These stories are stories, and I've always been fascinated with demonology and witchcraft and mysticism. Mysticism, really. This is not a religious thing. It's just, they're stories. You've got to have a beginning and a middle and an end, and you've got to have something to write about. So I've picked experiences that I had, and they're all very different stories, but as Jamie Kaplan of Thames and Hudson said, you know, the sum is greater than any of the parts. But I know exactly what you meant. These individual stories, you know, some are better than others, etc., but because they're all together, they have some kind of a thread and a mystical meaning. So you're right. I didn't do it intentionally. It's just with just the expression, just what I wanted to say.
The book is beautifully illustrated by the Brazilian artist Ana Maria Pacheco. In fact, I don't think I've ever seen a book more beautifully illustrated. She's literally painted a scene from each story, and often with reference to the story, sometimes implicit reference. Can you talk a little bit about your collaboration with her?
Well, all my books have my own photographs, you know, but in this particular case, well, Thames and Hudson really didn't want just photographs because they thought there were sort of strange stories breaking some kind of a barrier, and they wondered if I had, quotes, an illustrator. Well, somebody from the Royal Society of Portrait Painters suggested that I phone Ana Maria Pacheco, who is a Brazilian artist and who I think is a genius, who was the first foreign artist ever to have a one-man show at the National Gallery. I mean, she is an amazing person. I met her several times and talked to her, and then eventually, you know, she read the stories and then agreed to do not the illustrations, but the images, what she called the images. She said there's a difference. But the real reason she did these images is because she liked the stories, and because she also is a colonial, a displaced colonial, if you like, somebody who's lost everything from Brazil, and you know, and she just bonded with the stories, and I'm incredibly lucky. I'm incredibly lucky because, if you see the illustrations, I mean, they all really echo what I was trying to write, and it's really lucky to have something that you've written and to have somebody interpret it in this way.
Thank you very much. Tim, I want to turn to you to ask you about that journey that you undertook, aged 17, 18. You've written about being awed by the size of Africa and of seeing the paths disappearing either side of the highway and thinking, you know, of what would happen to you if you randomly followed one of the paths. Can you tell us a little bit more?
Well, yes, I was just an ordinary pre-student, actually. In those days, I was at school with a man who, at the age of 17, went to Africa and wrote a book called Zigzagged Timbuktu. His name was Bennett. I don't know what happened to him later, but he wrote this book, and I was immensely impressed with him. And it was then the sort of the fashion to try to do something, because if one got into Oxford and Cambridge and you got a scholarship quite soon, you could leave in the winter term, and then you had 9 months off. So it was like a gap year, but of course it wasn't called it then. And there was a great sense of sort of one-upmanship about doing things with your gap year. I guess that there is even now. And I was determined to do something really, really adventurous, and so I did do it. And interestingly enough, I mean, one would think that, given the fact that I was 18 and I wasn't being escorted by any sort of guides or hard travel people or whatever, but was just sort of going on my own. I mean, it was amazing my parents let me go, but I think that parents of my parents' generation had just lived through the war and, you know, had been hiding under the table, you know, during the bombing of London and everything, and it didn't sort of seem a terribly daring or dangerous thing. And also the great thing was that you weren't going to get texts or phone calls. You know, out of sight was really out of mind for months and months and months.
One last question over here.
Thank you. Just as an aside, actually, I met Wilfred Thesiger climbing in the Jebel Akhtar with his mate Bin Gabesha, and he actually signed my copy of Arabian Sands, which I had at the time. But my question concerns the Royal Geographic Society.
Royal Geographical.
The Royal Geographical Society, yes, of which I know you both have both direct and indirect associations. In the 19th century, it seemed to be a bit of a pit of vipers. They didn't seem to show a lot of leadership in sorting out these terrible fights between Burton and Speke and others. Do you have any comments on the
Yeah, well, the original headquarters were at 1 Savile Row. That's the original headquarters, not where they are in Kensington Gore now. And I don't think that's a fair comment about the Royal Geographical Society, because it was 1838, society. It became rather inward-looking, red chairs and cigar smokes and something, and an elitist kind of a society. But they were the only real society that sponsored this kind of thing. And when I mean sponsored, I mean in the real word, not just providing the money. The Vipers aren't internal. The Vipers were basically the explorers. I mean, the frustrated explorers who really wanted to find something and to put their name in history. And they wanted to be recognized, and they wanted to be famous. And most of this fighting, including Burton and Speke, I mean, they were good buddies before. And of course, they loathed each other in the end. And they not only did they distrust each other, and in the end probably dislike each other, but if you read all the explorations to the Nile or any other explorations, the most amazing thing is that that what they claim is so different. So I did the journey when I did the thing, really just to see who was right and who was wrong. And it is extraordinary when you go do the journey. It is amazing what you see, because what we know now about geography, they didn't know. So their achievement was unbelievable, 15,000 times anything that we could have done. But really, I think it was the people outside who were craving and needed sponsorship and were hungry to get their name and to win the great geographical prize, which is the source of the Nile. You should say something.
Yeah, well, I would just say that, I mean, on the whole, it was very difficult for both the Royal Geographical Society and the explorers. The main bugbear that they all had was that if they gave their discoveries straight away and published in the Society's journal, which they were expected to do, they lost the possibility of making a fortune from their own book. And it was very, very hard on them. That some method had to be made for sorting that out. Speke completely refused to take any part in this. And as a result of that, he was dropped by the person who had sponsored him.
Backwards.
Well, no, this was. I mean, obviously his publisher had sponsored him, but Sir Roderick Murchison had been his real hero. He was the president of the society and had got behind Speke and done everything for him. But as soon as he realised that Speke wasn't playing ball, wasn't producing the things, and wasn't giving him sole rights in the maps and everything else that he'd made, it was a very different story. And he pulled the plug on him, and Speke ended rather disgraced before his accident by going off and appealing to the French emperor to fund him, which at a time when France and Britain were not on the best of terms was to say the least, tactless. So the viperage came both ways. I mean, I do think that a man like Clements Markham, who was a very posh ground secretary, who was really horrible to Stanley. He discovered Stanley's secret, that he was a workhouse boy and that he was illegitimate. And he sort of held it over him. It was pretty nasty. I've read the letters they both exchanged. And so the aspect of snobbery within the society was very acute. This was a club of gents who liked their evenings to go well. And I think some of the explorers felt that they were risking their lives so that gentlemen in Savile Row could come in after their day's work and enjoy themselves in the evening with a talk. And meanwhile, there was Livingstone in Central Africa.
Can I just say just one
dying.
thing about it? I mean, the very good question, because really the competition was fierce. It was really fierce among these explorers and the achievers. I mean, interesting that you talked about Speke's suicide, for example. And I know Peter Speke is still alive.
No, not suicide.
No, I know. Talking about Speke's suicide. But what you don't I know that. But what I'm saying is that he was the man who had come back after the 1858 trip and discovering, quotes, the source of the Nile, and got instant fame. But then gradually, the controversy grew and people were against him. And in the 2 years before the debate in Bath, it was not suicide. It was not suicide, but his state of mind must have been in an incredible position. Here's a man who used to shooting. I mean, you wouldn't go across a low-style wall and put the butt of your gun on the ground. I mean, it's not the way you do it. I mean, I think he wasn't looking forward to the debate with Burton, who was a great debater. He was just in a terrible state because the whole world had very unfairly turned against him.
I think, though, that, I mean, one can look. He had been writing 10 hours before the accident. He'd been writing a letter, a very sort of sober and sane letter, to the mother of a female, to the father of a female explorer who'd rather sadly been killed by Tuaregs. And it was an incredibly sort of laid-back letter, which, if you know, I mean, maybe he was careless because he was thinking of the talk on the following day. And he knew that he was being stitched up. And he knew that Murchison was not looking after him. And his publisher wrote, saying, you know, that Speke was going to be got at not just by Murchison but by Livingstone, both of whom had, you know, an axe to grind. So it would have been strange if he'd been completely happy about what was going to happen the following day. But another letter he wrote 4 days earlier was to members of his old regiment, saying that it was a matter of honour that he would defend himself against Burton's allegations. And this is quite a long letter, and it does look to me awfully like a man who is very determined to put his best foot forward. Whatever else one thinks of Speke, he was exceptionally brave. I mean, you know, I can't really, it's the end of the day, and I won't give any examples, but he was a very, very brave individual, and I don't think that apart from inattention, he wasn't used, by the way, the Speke family say he wasn't used to shotguns. He had always shot with a rifle. And in fact, it was a shotgun what killed him.
Thank you very much, Tim Jeal, Christopher Ondaatje.
I think that's a discussion that could have continued, but as the monsoon starts, the talk must come to an end. I just want to thank our two speakers for their enthralling talks and for our chair for leading such a fascinating discussion. We've been transported to exotic climes. We've had close encounters with leopards, bakukums, and murderous locals. We've risked unmanly mutilations, and we've learnt that we should avoid being licked by lions. Clearly, the most awful terror that could face any explorer, however, is the remote control. Our speakers have instilled in all of us a desire, I think, to be explorers. But for those of us who are a little bit uncomfortable about the fact that you're going to have to suffer terribly and probably die in the process, fortunately, there is another way. We have the opportunity to buy Tim and Christopher's books. They've been transported to the Charleston tent by bearers at great personal risk, and you have the chance to go and buy them after this. If you could just allow us to clear the stage and go back to the bookmarquee before you leave your seats, I'd be very grateful.